I want to start today by asking you a seemingly impossible question.
Right.
What could an ancient Egyptian famine in, like 1750 BC, the philosophical writings of classical economists, and a 2016 Swiss election about free money possibly have in common?
Well, I mean, it definitely sounds like the setup to a really complicated joke.
Right. But this bizarre combination actually forms the philosophical backbone of the source material we are jumping into today.
Yeah, it's quite the mix.
It really is. We're looking at a fascinating excerpt titled, There is No Such Thing as a Free Lunch. And this comes from a book called 2025 U.S. Launches Correction by Yong Kang.
Right.
And our mission for this deep dive is to trace the very specific, very bold line drawn here, connecting ancient biblical history directly to modern economic policy.
Yeah, and before we get into the weeds on this, we really need to set a clear ground rule for this discussion.
Definitely.
Because, this text presents a highly specific, politically charged, Anglo-American conservative and religious viewpoint.
Very chart.
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive is absolutely not to endorse or validate or, take sides on these political views.
Right. We aren't here to judge if this economic worldview is right or wrong.
No, not at all. Our goal for you today is strictly analytical. We are just going to impartially unpack the arguments presented so you can clearly understand the historical and philosophical pillars that hold up this particular perspective.
Exactly. We are putting the text under a microscope to see exactly how its engine works.
Yeah.
And to understand the modern political stance we'll get to a bit later, we actually have to travel back a few millennia first.
Right. Back to the beginning.
We have to start with a story of survival, starvation, and some incredibly ruthless economics.
Yes, because the entire modern economic philosophy in this text is actually grounded in a biblical narrative from the book of Genesis.
Right.
Specifically, it's the story of Joseph taking place around 1750 BC.
Okay, let's unpack this because the framing of the story in the text is intense.
It really is.
So Joseph is the great-grandson of Abraham, and at age 17, his own brothers sell him into slavery in Egypt.
Which is a rough start.
Yeah, to say the least. But according to the narrative, he rises through the ranks through sheer resilience and divine favor. And by the time he is 30, he has become the prime minister of Egypt.
And almost immediately upon taking that role, he faces this huge existential crisis.
Right, the dream.
Exactly. Joseph receives a divine revelation that there will be 7 years of incredible agricultural abundance, followed immediately by 7 years of just catastrophic famine.
Like absolute devastation.
Total devastation. So during those good years, he builds up these massive centralized grain reserves. And when the famine finally hits, it absolutely destroys Egypt and the surrounding land of Canaan.
The land is just barren.
The land is barren. The people are facing mass starvation. And Egypt, literally solely thanks to Joseph's stockpiles, becomes the only place on earth with food.
And this is where we get into the actual mechanics of what happens next, which is fascinating. Because Joseph doesn't just open the silo doors and hand out the grain as some form of ancient disaster relief.
No, he does not.
He doesn't act like FEMA, He adheres to a strict, uncompromising principle of market exchange.
And this is really the critical turning point in the text's argument.
Right.
The focus here is entirely on the brutal reality of these transactions.
Right.
So year 1 of the famine, the starving population comes to Joseph. He has the grain, but he demands payment.
He makes them buy it.
He makes them buy it. So the people trade him all the money in Egypt and Canaan. Every piece of silver goes straight into Pharaoh's palace.
But, of course, the famine doesn't end.
No.
Year 2 rolls around, and the money is completely gone. The people come back still starving, and they basically say, our money is used up, give us food.
And Joseph doesn't budge?
Not an inch. He says, bring your livestock. So just to survive the year, they trade away their horses, their sheep, their cattle, their donkeys.
Whoa, all of it.
Yeah, all their wealth-generating assets, completely liquidated.
Which brings us to the final and really the most desperate phase of this economic collapse.
Yeah, the next year, the people return and essentially surrender everything.
Right.
They say, we have nothing left, no money, no animals. We only have our bodies and our land. Buy us and our land in exchange for food.
They voluntarily enter into servitude.
Exactly. They trade their fundamental freedom and their property to the state just for seed to plant. And Joseph establishes a new law.
A permanent one.
Yeah, from now on, Pharaoh owns the land, and the state gets 20%, so 1/5 of all future harvests forever, and the people get to keep 4/5 just to survive.
Although, with one notable structural exception in the text.
Oh, right, the priests.
Yeah, the priests did not have to sell their land.
Because they had a state allowance.
Exactly, a direct provision from Pharaoh. But for the general population, the fundamental reality of their society was permanently altered. I mean, they went from free landowners to state dependents.
Okay, I have to jump in here and push back on the logic a bit, because I imagine you are probably seeing the exact same paradox I am.
I think I know where you're going with this.
Right, because this worldview uses this specific story to praise the no free lunch, free market principle. It is held up as the bedrock for conservative economic thought.
Yes, absolutely.
But when you look at the mechanics of what actually happened, this was essentially a harsh corporate liquidation with no bailouts. And didn't this entire market exchange end with the state-like Pharaoh owning literally everything?
The land, the animals, the people, yeah.
Right. So how does anyone reconcile an absolute state monopoly with conservative free market values? It seems like a massive contradiction.
That is precisely the tension you have to navigate when reading this text. To really understand this perspective, you have to separate the ultimate outcome of the story from the mechanism used during the crisis.
Okay, separate the outcome from the mechanism.
Yeah. The lens here is hyper-focused on the mechanism of exchange itself. The fact that Joseph refused to give handouts, proving that if you need something to survive, you must give something of equal value for it. That is viewed not just as sound policy, but as a divine mandate.
Wow, okay.
It establishes this immovable law that value must be exchanged for value. Always.
So it's less about the specific historical outcome for Pharaoh and more about enforcing what they see as almost a law of physics.
Exactly.
You simply cannot get something for nothing.
That's it. This worldview argues that this refusal of the free lunch is the absolute anchor of Anglo-American conservative thought.
Right.
The premise is that even in the face of absolute catastrophe, market principles must hold firm. It is a deep, foundational opposition to what we would today call a welfare state.
So if the practical rule on the ground is no free lunch, what justifies that philosophically?
That's the big question.
Yeah, I mean, how do you build a moral defense for letting people starve if they literally have no assets left to trade?
Well, to answer that, we really have to look at what this ideology considers the most sacred of all human rights.
Which is property.
Yes,
Yeah.
property. The argument makes a massive sweeping transition here. It posits that economic freedom is the single most fundamental of all freedoms,
Okay.
and that property rights are the most crucial rights a human being can possibly possess. The core thesis of the text is that without property rights, all your other supposed rights are functionally meaningless.
It's like, imagine your smartphone for a second.
Okay, I'm with you.
Think of property rights like the core operating system, like the iOS or the Android system on your phone.
Right.
Now, you might care way more about the specific apps on that phone. You have your freedom of speech app, your freedom of religion app, your right to peacefully assemble app.
The things you actually use.
Exactly. Those are the features you interact with every day. But if you uninstall the operating system, if you remove property rights, none of those beautiful apps can run.
The whole system just
The
crashes.
screen just goes black.
That is actually a brilliant way to translate the classical economic theory being leveraged here.
It helps to visualize it, I think.
It really does.
Yeah.
Because to build this case, the author drafts a very specific lineup of historical thinkers to reinforce the architecture of this argument.
And it's a heavy-hitting list.
Very much so. It starts with Edmund Burke, the famous Anglo-Irish statesman.
Right.
Burke argued that the state exists primarily to protect property. But it goes deeper than just, protecting wealth for the wealthy.
How so?
Well, Burke claimed that it was specifically the disregard for property that triggered the crimes which destroyed France during the French Revolution.
Right, because when the state stops protecting private property and starts seizing estates or, allowing mobs to confiscate wealth, the fundamental social contract evaporates.
Exactly. The trust that holds society together breaks down.
And then you get the guillotine and total chaos.
Precisely. The logic is that without secure property, society just devolves into brute force.
It's just terrifying.
It is. And from Burke, the argument naturally bridges to Russell Kirk.
Right. He was a major figure in 20th century American conservatism.
He was. And Kirk takes it a step further by directly linking property to freedom. He argued that economic leveling, like any attempt to forcefully make everyone's wealth equal, inherently destroys economic progress.
Why does he say that?
Because enforcing total equality requires a massive, coercive central authority.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, once property is removed from private ownership to achieve that equality, individual freedom simply ceases to exist.
Because if you don't control your own resources, you are completely at the mercy of whoever does control them.
Exactly.
Which leads perfectly into the Nobel Prize-winning economist Friedrich Hayek.
Yes, a very prominent voice in this text.
Right, he famously asserted that the very first requirement of personal freedom is economic freedom. If the state controls your money, the state controls your choices.
You can't do anything.
You really can't. You can't fund a dissenting newspaper or build a church or, start a political movement without resources.
And perhaps the sharpest critique on this point comes from the American academic Irving Babbitt.
What was his angle?
He argued that every form of what we call social justice tends to expropriate private property.
Okay, now social justice is obviously a highly charged term today.
Very much so.
How exactly does Babbitt define the mechanics of that danger in the text?
The mechanism of danger, according to Babbitt, is the act of confiscation itself.
Okay.
When a government decides to take property from one group to give it to another in the name of justice, it inherently undermines the foundation of moral standards.
Because you're redefining justice.
Exactly. You are redefining justice as the power to forcefully take things. The argument concludes that at that point, true justice is entirely replaced by cunning and brute force.
Basically, justice is no longer about objective right and wrong. It just becomes about who has enough political power to legally take someone else's stuff.
Yes, that's exactly the concern.
This worldview even pulls Aristotle into the mix, right?
It does, yeah.
Pointing out that even back in ancient Greece, Aristotle recognized the total folly of collectivist utopias. He understood that attempting to abolish private property actually erodes human morality.
Now, here's where a counterintuitive pivot happens in the text.
Okay.
And it is vital for you to grasp this if you really want to understand this perspective. There is an obvious critique to all of this.
That property rights are just a shield for the rich.
Exactly. Aren't property rights just a convenient excuse for billionaires to hoard their wealth?
Right.
But the ideological response here firmly insists that property rights are actually vastly more crucial for the poor than they are for the rich.
Now, that sounds completely backwards at first glance.
It does.
How is protecting property rights more important for someone who currently owns nothing?
Because, the argument goes, property rights provide the only possible ladder out of poverty.
Oh, I see.
If private property doesn't exist, or if it isn't strictly protected by the rule of law, then no matter how hard you work, you can never build wealth.
You can't save anything.
Right. You can never safely keep the fruits of your own labor. In systems where private property is abolished or heavily compromised, the entire nation simply becomes the private estate of the ruling elite.
And that brings us right back to the Egyptian famine.
It really does.
Because if the state owns everything, like Pharaoh did after the crisis, then everyone else is just a serf. You are entirely dependent on the elite's generosity just to get your next meal.
Exactly.
So in this view, defending property rights isn't about protecting yachts or mansions. It's about making self-reliance possible.
It's defending the right to life itself.
Right, because ownership is the firewall that separates a free human civilization from a state of total dependency.
So if property rights are the operating system of freedom, the ultimate protector of civilization.
What is the ultimate virus?
Yes. What is the greatest modern predator attacking those rights?
The welfare state.
Exactly. This is where philosophical theory transforms into aggressive, modern policy critique.
Right.
There is a fierce, unyielding opposition to the welfare state presented here.
And the mechanics of this opposition are pretty straightforward, aren't they?
Very straightforward. Welfare programs require massive funding. Massive funding requires excessive taxation. And excessive taxation, by its very nature in this view, is the government forcefully confiscating private property.
It is viewed as a direct structural infringement on those sacred property rights we just talked about.
Absolutely.
And beyond just the economic impact, it is argued that the welfare state does something deeply insidious to the human spirit.
Right. It systematically erodes personal responsibility.
There is a profound distinction made here that really gets to the core of this worldview. It acknowledges that welfare measures certainly increase a population's sense of security.
Sure, having a safety net feels secure.
But it draws a hard, immovable line. Security is not the same thing as freedom.
That is a massive philosophical divide.
It really is. To this specific conservative mindset, freedom is fundamentally defined as the freedom to choose. You simply cannot tie true freedom to a guaranteed, comfortable outcome. The essence of freedom is the ability to make choices, absolutely. But crucially, it is the uncompromising ability to bear the consequences of those choices.
Whether they lead to success or absolute failure.
Exactly. If there's a guaranteed safety net catching you no matter what you do, the argument is that your choices lose their weight. They don't actually matter anymore.
And to back up the danger of this, Milton Friedman is brought in again.
Yes.
Friedman warned that a true free market economy creates decentralized centers of economic power.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, if thousands of different private businesses hold the money, power is spread out. It's decentralized. But if the government controls the wealth to provide welfare, political power centralizes into one authoritarian state.
Because the state has all the money.
Exactly. Building on Friedman, the premise here is that using government power to manufacture equality is inherently unsafe. It argues that diversity and complexity, meaning widely different outcomes, rich and poor, monumental success and total failure, those are actually the defining hallmarks of a vibrant civilized society.
And enforcing uniformity through the state stifles that vitality.
Precisely.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate again for a moment.
Go for it.
Because we really need to test the structural integrity of this logic for you listening.
Sure.
The ideology states that freedom is the ability to choose, and we should never force equality of outcomes.
Right.
But doesn't extreme, starving poverty, like the exact kind of poverty the welfare state was designed to alleviate, doesn't that completely obliterate a person's ability to choose anyway?
That is the classic counterargument.
Right, because if you are starving on the street, you have no choices. How does this framework address the severe tension between basic human survival and its terror of forced equality?
It is a profound challenge.
Yeah.
And it is important to note that this specific ideology does not offer a compromise here.
They don't budge.
They do not budge. There is no middle ground solution presented. The stance remains entirely rigid, attempting to manufacture equality of outcome via government power inherently accelerates the destruction of human society.
Wow.
In this calculus, the cure, meaning the welfare state, is viewed as vastly more dangerous and terminal than the disease of inequality.
So they genuinely believe the welfare state is a direct, unavoidable pipeline to tyranny.
Yes, which leads directly into a chilling final warning in the text.
Okay.
This total philosophical rejection of free security culminates in an examination of what happens when modern society flirts with these ideas today.
Right. The focus turns directly onto the Marxist utopian ideal.
Yes.
Specifically, the famous phrase, distribution according to need. This worldview completely rejects that as an absurd fantasy.
And why is that?
Because the mechanics of distribution according to need require someone to actually determine the need and then enforce the distribution.
Right.
And that always requires a massive authoritarian force. It is viewed as a seductive slogan that has historically misled entire generations.
And to really drive the danger of that seduction home, a very vivid metaphor is used, anchored by a quote from the New Testament.
The Apostle Paul.
Yes. The Apostle Paul in 2 Thessalonians is quoted saying, "Work quietly and eat your own bread."
Emphasizing the own in your own bread.
Exactly. And this introduces the concept of the hidden dagger.
Oh, this is such a striking image.
It is. The warning goes like this. Beware, because the free bread you receive from the state comes with a hidden dagger.
Right.
If you rely on those free meals for too long, one day you will wake up and find that not only has the bread supply been cut off, but you have also lost your freedom to go out and get it yourself.
It is a really evocative, terrifying image. The idea that state dependency is a trap that springs shut the very moment you forget how to feed yourself.
Yeah.
And what makes this so fascinating is that this isn't just left as, ancient biblical history or abstract 20th century economic theory.
No, it's very contemporary.
Right. This entire argument is brought crashing into the modern real world with a specific historical test case.
June 5th, 2016, Switzerland.
Yes. A nationwide referendum was held in Switzerland.
Right.
The citizens were voting on implementing an unconditional basic income, a UBI.
Which is huge.
And the stakes of this vote were incredibly concrete. The proposal was to give every single adult citizen 2,500 Swiss francs every single month.
Wow.
And 625 francs for every child. No strings attached.
Literally free money.
Literally, no work requirements whatsoever. True unconditional free money.
For context, that is a substantial amount of guaranteed income. It was the ultimate real-world test of the free lunch concept, taking place in a highly developed, modern European democracy.
So given the direct democratic choice to legally vote themselves a guaranteed permanent income, what did the Swiss population actually do?
The outcome was a landslide, but perhaps not the one many would expect.
No.
77% of Swiss voters overwhelmingly rejected the proposal.
Almost 80%.
Yeah. They looked at the free money and they voted no.
And how does the ideological lens of our source material interpret that staggering rejection?
Well, it claims this rejection was primarily due to the steadfast Christian faith woven into the culture of the Swiss citizens.
Okay.
According to this worldview, the voters saw right through the proposal. They did not see the UBI as a generous gift or as, a piece of cake to be enjoyed.
They saw the dagger.
Exactly. They recognized the hidden dagger. They viewed the free money as a poison
Yeah.
that would inevitably lead to the self-destruction of their community and their work ethic.
I want you to look at the incredible symmetry of the argument we've just unpacked today.
Yeah, it really ties together.
Think about how perfectly bookended this is. It starts thousands of years ago with an ancient Egyptian famine. Desperate, starving people traded literally everything they possessed, their money, their livestock, their land, their own physical bodies, to the central state just to survive the crisis. And the journey ends in 2016 in one of the wealthiest modern nations on the planet, where citizens actively voted against receiving free money from the state, specifically to preserve their societal structure and their individual freedom.
It is a stark, fascinating contrast, and it perfectly encapsulates the entire analytical journey we have taken today.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We really have. We moved from Joseph's centralized grain silos in the ancient desert through the foundational philosophies of thinkers like Burke and Hayek, who warned against the state absorbing private property,
Right.
and ended directly at the modern ballot box, where those exact theories were put to a national vote.
So what is the ultimate takeaway from all of this? Why does unpacking this specific text matter for how you process the world?
Well, understanding this material gives you a crystal clear, high-resolution map of the DNA of staunch conservative economic thought.
Okay.
It shows you exactly how the mechanics of classical liberalism,
Yeah.
the intense focus on individual liberty and private property, are deeply intertwined with strict biblical interpretation.
They're inseparable in this case.
Completely inseparable. Through this lens, economics is not just math or public policy. It is morality.
Right.
It is a divine mechanism where forced equality is inherently dangerous and private property rights are the sacred, indispensable firewall protecting human freedom from the hidden dagger of state control.
It certainly changes the filter on how you might listen to political debates about taxation, welfare, or basic income on the news tonight.
Oh, absolutely.
You can see the deep historical and philosophical roots beneath the talking points now. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final lingering question to ponder on your own.
Okay.
It builds on the text we analyzed today, but it flips the perspective just a bit.
Let's hear it.
So this worldview explicitly uses the story of Joseph to praise the principle of no free lunch and to fiercely defend the free market against state handouts.
Right.
But considering that Joseph's system ended with the government pharaoh owning absolutely all the land, all the livestock, and the people effectively becoming serfs, entirely dependent on a central state, does this ancient story actually serve as a massive, glaring warning against unregulated markets during a crisis rather than a defense of them?
Wow. That is a brilliant tension to leave unresolved. It really makes you question the ultimate destination of these economic mechanisms when taken to their absolute extremes.
Definitely something to chew on the next time someone offers to buy you lunch. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for listening.
Keep questioning what you read, keep looking for those deeper hidden connections in the world around you, and we will catch you next time.